She opened the saloon door, and every pair of boots stopped moving. The piano notes froze mid-chord. A cowboy lowered his drink, mid-sip. Dust swirled through the wooden doorway as a Japanese woman in an oversized army-issued coat stepped over the threshold of a West Texas saloon. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not in a place with tobacco smoke, brass spittoons, and poker chips clacking like bones. The war had barely ended. Her enemy's boots were still warm, and yet here she stood, thin, silent. A prisoner of war, no longer behind fences, but now face to face with the men who once feared her. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She only scanned the room, as if searching for a trap. But what came next wasn't cruelty. It was music, laughter, and the scent of cornbread and whiskey. The tension cracked like a dry twig. What was she doing here? And what would this moment teach everyone inside that saloon about honor, shame, and the terrifying power of being seen? The door creaked as it swung inward, its hinges complaining just loudly enough to announce her arrival without offering her any shelter. For half a second, nothing happened. Then the room reacted as if a string had been pulled tight and suddenly released. Boots that had been tapping against the plank floor stopped mid-beat. A deck of cards froze halfway through a shuffle. The piano player's fingers hovered above the keys, the last note hanging unfinished in the smoky air. Even the laughter died, not abruptly, but as if it had been gently smothered by an unseen hand. Silence pooled around her, thick and uncomfortable. She stood just inside the doorway, the light from outside framing her like a cutout. The saloon smelled of sweat, tobacco, and something fried in grease, a heavy, almost sweet scent that made her stomach tighten instinctively. Her army-issued coat hung too loose on her narrow shoulders, the sleeves swallowing her hands. Dust clung to the hem where it brushed the threshold. She did not step forward. Not yet. Years of training told her to wait, to assess, to prepare for the blow that would surely come next. Her eyes moved slowly across the room. Boots first, heavy leather, scuffed toes, spurs dulled from use, then the legs above them, planted wide, confident, unafraid. These were men who took up space without apology. She had been taught to fear that kind of posture. In her mind, American men were supposed to leer, to shout, to rush forward with rough hands and cruel smiles. She braced herself for laughter, for a slur she could not understand but would recognize all the same. Her jaw tightened, her shoulders locked. But none of that happened. They just stared. From the other side of the room, the cowboys took her in piece by piece, unsure what they were seeing. This was not the image they had carried through the war. This was not a snarling enemy soldier or a fanatic willing to die at the snap of a command. This was a woman, a small one, too thin, too still. Her face held no challenge, no hatred, only a kind of guarded emptiness that unsettled them more than anger ever could. One man near the bar slowly lowered his glass to the counter, the amber liquid inside sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Another shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how loud his boots sounded on the floor. No one spoke, not because they were being polite, but because none of them knew what the correct words were anymore. She took a single step forward. The floorboard creaked beneath her weight, impossibly loud in the stillness. Several men flinched, not backward, but inward, as if bracing for a realization they had not asked for. She noticed it, the way their eyes widened just a fraction, the way one man's hand drifted unconsciously away from his belt, as if remembering there was no need for a weapon here. This place was not a battlefield, and she was not acting like an enemy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat sharp and insistent. She told herself not to bow. Not here. Not now. She lifted her chin instead, just enough to meet their gazes without defiance. What she saw there confused her more than cruelty would have. There was no triumph in their eyes, no hunger, just curiosity, threaded with something that looked dangerously close to discomfort. The war image they had been carrying cracked in that moment. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough to let doubt seep in. And as she stood there, framed by a swinging door that refused to decide whether it was opening or closing, every person in the room understood the same unsettling truth at the same time. Whatever this was going to be, it was no longer the story any of them had been told. The first story she had been told began on a dock blackened by soot and defeat. Aiko stood among dozens of other women, nurses, clerks, auxiliaries awaiting shipment like crates of broken equipment. No one cried, not because there was no sadness, but because emotion had been drilled out of them long before surrender. They boarded the ship one by one, the rusted gangplank trembling beneath their boots. Aiko kept her eyes down, arms pressed to her sides, her stomach hollow from more than hunger. The crossing was slow, and the sea unforgiving. The hold stank of salt, diesel, and bodies too long without fresh linen. They were given bread, real bread, and coffee that burned the tongue. Aiko drank it slowly, suspiciously, half convinced it was drugged. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet. No sirens, no slogans. Just the hum of American engines and the occasional barked command from a guard who did not shout insults. She waited for the cruelty to begin, but it didn't. When they disembarked in America, the light stung her eyes. She expected gray skies, barbed wire, maybe shouting crowds. Instead, the sun was bright and warm. Horses stood tied near the road. Trees rustled. And far in the distance, a dog barked not in warning but in greeting. She looked around and saw houses, white-fenced, with laundry flapping in the breeze. Her breath caught. If this was a prison, it was unlike anything she had imagined. The trucks drove them for hours, cutting through endless miles of grass and sky. She did not know the name of the place, only that it smelled like heat and dust. When the vehicle finally stopped, she was helped down by a soldier who didn't even meet her eyes. That was the first sign that things were different. The second was the barbed wire. It was there, yes, but behind it stood buildings painted fresh, clean paths, a watchtower unmanned, a flag waving not in conquest, but routine. The camp was a ranch, or had once been. Now it had beds and barracks. She was handed a blanket, a comb, and a pair of socks so soft she thought they must be a mistake. No one yelled. No one touched her. Her name was recorded, her weight measured. 69 pounds. She overheard it in a whisper, spoken like a diagnosis. The American nurse who examined her didn't wear a weapon, just gloves. The meals were warm, real meat, vegetables. She didn't trust them at first. She watched the guards eat from the same trays before she let the food touch her lips. When she finally tasted it, rich broth and soft potatoes, her jaw stiffened in disbelief. The warmth spread through her chest like guilt. Around her, other girls wiped tears with trembling fingers. Aiko did not cry. She only stared at her tray like it was a betrayal. And then there was the silence. At night, she expected screaming. Orders barked in a foreign tongue. But all she heard were the lowing of cattle and, once, a harmonica played softly near the mess hall. The quiet unnerved her more than the worst threats. She'd grown up with scarcity and shame, with the unspoken knowledge that a woman in war was a tool, disposable and silent. But here, they were called by name, given soap, given time. The fence still stood, but it did not confine her the way her past had. And yet, when she was invited to leave its shadow, to step beyond it into a saloon full of American men, something ancient inside her recoiled. This was not about rules. It was about freedom. And freedom, after so much discipline, felt like stepping into open air without a parachute. No one forced her to go. That was the strangest part. The guards said she could say no, that it was only music, only food. But something in the way they looked at her, curious, careful, almost respectful, made her legs move forward before her mind agreed. She walked. And so the girl who once slept beneath bombing raids now stood on a porch, squinting at a swinging door, her fingers clenched into fists beneath borrowed sleeves. She reached for the handle and stepped into the unknown. Inside her chest, the code still whispered. Bushido was not something she had memorized. It had been pressed into her quietly, repeatedly, until it became muscle memory. Her earliest memories were of stillness, of kneeling, of silence at the dinner mat while her father adjusted his uniform and her mother folded the radio down low. Strength was not loud. It was quiet endurance. Her brother had once told her that a girl's worth was measured in how much she could carry without complaint. Aiko had believed him. She had carried silence, sickness, hunger, and duty, all without once asking why. At school, the teacher had drawn a circle on the blackboard, the emperor at the center. Every line radiated outward. Family, army, nation, herself. She was barely a dot. A girl was meant to serve, not to think, to obey, not to ask. And when the leaflets came down from American plains, words promising safety, kindness, mercy, they had been gathered and burned before anyone could read them. Kindness was a trick, she was told. There was no such thing in war. So when she stepped into the saloon, her body may have crossed the threshold, but her mind lagged behind, tangled in decades of teachings. She felt the rules fray around her ankles like torn rope. She was not supposed to see the enemy smile. She was not supposed to hear music drifting from a wooden piano, played not for ceremony or death, but for joy. This place was wrong, wrong in a way that felt too gentle to resist. And then there were the men. Her instructors had warned her what would happen if the Americans took her. She had been told they were crude, base, inhuman. She remembered the photos, propaganda sketches of leering men with jagged teeth and clenched fists. She had once folded one of those papers into a paper crane just to make it disappear. The fear had been real enough to shape how she walked, how she breathed. She had learned not to look up, not to meet a man's eye, not to invite attention. But these men didn't leer. They didn't laugh. They looked at her as if they didn't know what they were looking at, as if they expected someone else to be standing in her place. She was prepared to be mocked, to be cursed, to be dismissed as a thing. But instead, one man stood from his table and cleared a chair. Another set down a glass of water. The piano resumed its lazy rhythm. The tension thinned, not vanished, but loosened just enough to let in air. Still, Aiko sat on edge, hands in her lap, eyes on the wood-grain table. The way the laughter, though foreign, did not sting. She tried not to remember the first time she tasted soup at the ranch, how it had nearly broken her. The salt, the warmth, the sheer impossibility of it. Kindness was not supposed to have flavor, nor was soap supposed to smell like flowers. She had washed with it weeks ago, real soap, creamy and dense, placed in her hand by a nurse who smiled like she had done nothing remarkable. Aiko had stared at the bar for 10 full seconds before daring to believe it wasn't a test. The music in the saloon shifted again. A new song, slower, melancholy, Someone whistled off-key. A burst of laughter followed. She flinched at the sound, not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. She looked down at her boots. American-issued. Clean. Too large. She wasn't sure who she was anymore in those boots. Not a soldier. Not a prisoner. Not exactly a girl either. Just Aiko. And that was the most terrifying identity of all. Because if she was just Aiko, then the decisions were hers. To speak. To smile. To sit in a saloon and accept a drink. No one was forcing her. No one was threatening her. The bars were gone. The guns were holstered. What she faced now was not violence, it was freedom. And freedom, she realized, required courage of a different kind. She didn't remember deciding to sit down, but there she was, lowering herself slowly onto a wooden chair that creaked under her weight like it had something to say. The seat was warm from the last man who had occupied it. She placed her hands in her lap and focused on her breath. The tension in the room had thinned, but it hadn't vanished. It lingered in the corners, in the way conversation hesitated to resume, in the way glances still flicked toward her like moths testing the edge of a flame. The room had a pulse, slow and steady. A ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, slicing the warm air with a dull hum. The oil lamps gave off more heat than light, their glow pooling on the tables, casting long shadows on the floorboards. The saloon smelled of tobacco and dust, and something rich pepper, maybe, or cumin beneath it all, the sharp undertone of whiskey that made the air feel thick in the lungs. She could hear spurs clinking with every shift of a boot. A chair scraped the floor, startling her. But it was only a man adjusting his position, not rising in anger. A cowboy in a sun-bleached shirt approached. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if not to startle a skittish colt. His boots hit the floor with that same rhythm all the men seemed to carry, a cadence of quiet authority. He didn't say anything, just motioned with his hand toward a small bowl on the bar counter. A few steps later, he set it down in front of her. Chilly. Steam curled upward, catching the lamplight. A spoon rested in it. Handle turned toward her. Aiko didn't move. The man tapped the table twice, knuckles soft against wood, then stepped away. No demand, no pressure, just a gesture that said, "Here, if you want it." From the corner of the room, someone plucked the first twangy notes of a banjo. It was clumsy at first, half-hearted, even, but the rhythm grew. Not polished, not rehearsed, just real. A lazy, looping melody that filled the awkward spaces like warm water. Another voice joined in, low and humming. Then laughter not at her, but between them at a missed note or forgotten lyric. A glass clinked against another. A chair rocked back, then forward, and the saloon began to breathe again. She stared at the bowl. The chili looked dense. Beans and meat in a thick red sauce. Bits of onion and pepper floated near the surface. The smell was unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. Her stomach tightened with the memory of hunger, not the sharp kind, but the old companion that sat quietly in the background of her every day. She reached for the spoon, slowly, as if it might burn her. Her fingers curled around the metal. The first bite was cautious. She brought it to her lips, paused, then slipped it into her mouth. Heat bloomed instantly, spice, salt, something smoky. Her tongue jerked instinctively. Her eyes blinked wide. It was too much, and yet she swallowed. It sat heavy in her throat, warming her from the inside out. She took another bite, smaller this time, and another. The banjo plucked on. A different cowboy whistled along with it, off-key and too loud. Someone laughed. It was a rough sound, but unthreatening. Aiko glanced up, unsure whether to smile or brace. But no one looked at her like she was out of place anymore. She was just there. A girl at a table, eating chili. A man leaned back and tipped his hat toward her. It wasn't mockery, just a nod, a flicker of recognition. She didn't nod back, but she didn't look away either. The warmth of the food, the smell of tobacco and spice, the lazy rhythm of banjo strings, it all mixed into a slow unraveling. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction. Her hand no longer trembled with the spoon. A single thought passed through her, like smoke rising into rafters. This isn't what they said it would be. And for the first time that night, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The taste lingered on her tongue, thick with spices she couldn't name, but it was the ghosts, not the food, that filled her mouth. She lowered the spoon halfway to the bowl and stared into it. But what she saw was not chili, it was broth, thin and gray, swirled with ashes from the makeshift fire her mother had used to boil weeds behind their house. The memory came unbidden. Her mother's hands, cracked and raw, moving rhythmically over a pot that steamed more from desperation than from heat. No seasoning, no salt, just steam and silence. Aiko blinked. The saloon's noise faded in and out like a radio signal. One moment, laughter and banjo strings. The next, the whistle of air raid sirens that lived only in her bones now. The bowl in front of her was real. She knew that. The food was warm, heavy, rich with meat. She had swallowed it. She had accepted it. And that was the problem. Her brother's face came next. Satoshi had smiled once. Just once. Before he left for the war, before the uniform, before the orders. He had tousled her hair and told her that good sisters don't cry when heroes leave. She hadn't cried. Not then. Not even when the letter came. Brief and merciless. Missing. Presumed dead. She remembered looking at the characters over and over again, as if the ink might rearrange itself into hope. It never did. He would have starved by now, she thought. Or worse. And here she was, fed. She forced another spoonful into her mouth, not out of hunger, but out of duty. It was soft against her teeth, and the flavors burst again. Garlic, onion, oil. Her stomach accepted it greedily. Her mind did not. Every bite felt like betrayal. The ghosts sat with her. Her mother, skeletal in the corner of a dim room. Her neighbors, shivering in cellars. The girl down the street with the pink ribbon who stopped speaking after the firebombs. They did not ask her to stop eating, but their silence screamed, "How dare you?" The room laughed again. A glass shattered somewhere, and cheers followed. The war was far away here. The walls of the saloon held no scars. The windows were whole. The men in the room did not jump at sudden sounds. They leaned into them. They made noise on purpose. It was how they lived. She watched one of them throw his head back and laugh so hard he slapped the table. She flinched, not because it frightened her, but because the normalcy of it pierced something soft inside her chest. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave. They were not supposed to sing, or play games, or hand her chili with a nod and no questions. They were not supposed to treat her like she mattered. Her shoulders tensed again, but the blanket of warmth from the food made it hard to hold the posture. Her spine sagged a little, her hands unfolded on the table, and still the guilt clung like damp cloth. This food wasn't just food. It was proof. Proof that her suffering wasn't inevitable. That someone, somewhere, had chosen differently. And what did that make her now? A prisoner? A guest? A girl who had survived when better people hadn't? She lifted the spoon again, and for a second it shook, but then the music changed. A slow, swaying tune, no lyrics, just notes that bent in a way that made her throat tighten. Across the room, someone hummed along, a woman's voice. A fellow POW, sitting near the far wall, eyes closed. The ghosts didn't vanish, but they quieted. She took another bite, and this time she didn't taste betrayal. She tasted sorrow, and strangely mercy. The word lingered in her chest like an echo, unfamiliar and unsettling, when a chair scraped softly across the floor. A man stood, not abruptly, not with the stiff authority she associated with officers or guards. He rose the way someone does when they've decided to speak but are not yet sure they should. His hat was pushed back on his head, revealing a weathered face browned by sun and years of wind. He cleared his throat once, then again, as if the sound itself needed permission. He did not tower over her. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands loose at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was low, carrying the slow drawl of someone used to open spaces rather than commands. "Miss," he began, then hesitated, clearly unsure if that was the right word. The room quieted again, but this time the silence felt different, less brittle, more curious. "What's your name?" The question landed heavier than any insult ever could have. Aiko's fingers tightened around the spoon. Her name was not something she offered lightly. In Japan, names were used sparingly, often swallowed by titles and roles. Nurse, daughter, auxiliary, prisoner. Her name had become private, folded inward, something to protect. Speaking it aloud here, in this place, felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge without knowing whether it would hold. She did not answer. The cowboy nodded slowly, as if he expected that. "Sorry," he said, fumbling slightly, then gestured toward his own chest. "Name's Tom." He said it like an offering, not a demand. Tom. One word. Simple. No rank. No honorific. Aiko lifted her eyes to his face. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was just waiting. The saloon seemed to hold its breath. Her mouth felt dry. English words crowded her thoughts, clumsy and sharp-edged. She knew how to say thank you. She knew how to say yes and no. Her name felt more dangerous than any of them, because once spoken, it could not be taken back. "I." Her voice cracked on the first syllable. She stopped, swallowed, tried again. "Aiko!" The sound of it surprised her. It sounded smaller in English, softer, but it was hers. Tom nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if committing the sound to memory. "Aiko," he repeated carefully. He did not butcher it. He did not rush. The effort alone made something loosen in her chest. Around them, the room shifted. Someone murmured the name under their breath, testing it. Another man smiled faintly, like he had just been introduced to a stranger at a church picnic rather than a former enemy. The banjo player plucked a quiet chord, then stopped, realizing the moment didn't need music. In that instant, she felt herself change shape in their eyes. She was no longer the Japanese woman, no longer the POW. She was Aiko, a person who could be addressed, recognized, remembered. The danger of that realization hit her a heartbeat later, because if she was real to them, she had to be real to herself. Tom shifted his weight, suddenly awkward again, and pointed gently at the bowl in front of her. "You all right with that?" he asked, nodding at the chili. "Little spicy." She nodded. Once. Then, surprising herself, she added, "It's warm." The word came out careful and precise, like a fragile object being set on a shelf. A grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he said simply. "Glad." No one clapped. No one cheered. But something invisible crossed the room, thin, delicate, and irreversible. The saloon was no longer a test. It became a place where a question had been asked without cruelty, where an answer had been given without punishment, where language, imperfect and halting, had built a bridge stronger than fear. Aiko took another bite of chili. It tasted the same, but it sat differently now, as if her body understood something her mind was only beginning to accept. She had not been summoned. She had been invited, and with one spoken name, the room had changed its shape around her. Now, something else shifted, not in the room, but within her. Aiko watched the cowboys laugh, their voices rolling like distant thunder across the wooden rafters. One man slapped another on the back, sending a wave of spilled whiskey across the table. Glasses clinked, laughter swelled, and yet none of it felt directed at her. She was not the subject of the merriment, nor its target. She was simply present, unharmed, undemanded, seen. She sipped the cold water in her tin cup. It had no taste, but the weight of it grounded her. It was not sake. It was not tea. It was something else entirely, something neutral, safe, untouched by history. Then, one of the cowboys, younger than the others, with sand-colored hair that curled just beneath his hat, walked over with a small object in hand. He extended it toward her, a harmonica. Aiko blinked. For a moment, she didn't understand. Was it a weapon? A toy? He wiggled it slightly, miming the motion of playing. His grin was crooked, and his boots tapped lightly against the wooden floor. "Here," he said, "give it a try." The room quieted, not in anticipation, but in shared amusement. Aiko hesitated, then reached out and took it with both hands, as if it might shatter. The metal was cool, unfamiliar. She brought it to her lips and blew. The sound that came out was something between a sneeze and a goose in distress, a strangled honk that made her wince and then, before she could stop herself, laugh. A real laugh. The kind that came from the stomach, not the throat. It startled her. She hadn't heard that sound come from her own mouth in what felt like centuries. The cowboys burst into laughter too, not mockery, but a collective release, like boys who'd just seen someone trip on purpose. "Lord," one of them chuckled, "she plays about as well as Hank after 2 bottles of corn mash." Someone tossed a peanut across the room. Another banged the table twice with a fist. Aiko pressed the harmonica back to her mouth and tried again. This time, she produced a softer sound, no better in quality, but now laced with intention. For the first time, she was not an outsider trying to avoid notice. She was a participant. The harmonica came down. She looked at it in her palm. Strange that something so small could do what months of guards and fences could not make her feel human again. The banjo joined in. A loose, lazy melody drifted from the corner of the saloon. Aiko found herself tapping her toe. One of the men nodded along with her, and before long, the rhythm belonged to them all. She wasn't being interrogated. She wasn't being judged. She wasn't being used. She was being included. It was a kind of treason her commanders never warned her about, the danger of joy, of being welcomed without being needed, of sharing a laugh in the shadow of grief. This was not surrender. It was something quieter, more intimate, a temporary freedom that neither permission nor forgiveness could define. And sitting there, harmonica in hand, Aiko realized something radical. For the first time since she stepped off the ship in Texas, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a girl, not a soldier, not a symbol, just A girl in a saloon, sipping water, holding a harmonica, surrounded by laughter that did not hurt. She looked around. The banjo player winked at her. Someone poured more whiskey not for her, but beside her. A bowl of peanuts slid across the table. The world was still strange, still dangerous. But in this moment, it was also wide open. And somewhere deep within, she wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, she had begun to open too. The sky above the ranch had turned to lavender by the time she returned. The stars waited, pinned silently above the barracks like watchful gods. Her steps were slow, not from fatigue, but from something gentler like the afterglow of a strange dream. In her hand, she still held the harmonica, wrapped now in a folded handkerchief one of the ranch hands had offered. A keepsake, a whisper of something unnameable. She climbed the steps of the barrack with care, avoiding the creaking ones. Inside, the other women stirred softly, folding their clothes, preparing their mats. No one asked where she had been, but a few glanced at her, not with suspicion, but curiosity. She met no one's eye. Instead, she sat by the small desk near the corner and took out a pencil and the sheet of thin, lined paper the Red Cross had allowed. She stared at it for a long time. Writing was a sacred thing in her family. Letters were reserved for honor, death, or obedience. But tonight, her hand moved, slowly, as if drawn by something older than shame. She wrote, "Dearest Mother, tonight I walked into a place I was told never to imagine. It had music, it had smoke, it had laughter, and Americans, men in leather boots and plaid shirts. Cowboys, they call them." Her pencil paused. Her breath did too. But she continued. They did not shout. They did not jeer. One handed me a bowl of chili. Another handed me a harmonica. I played it badly. They laughed. So did I. I think they were surprised. So was I. Another pause. There was no weapon in their hands. Only spoons. And instruments. I do not know what it means. I do not understand this country. But tonight, I was not afraid. She stopped there. That last line trembled on the page, a confession both quiet and loud. I was not afraid. She reread it twice. She didn't cross it out. She folded the paper carefully, sealed it in the envelope, and marked it for the censors, as all POWs were required. She knew the Japanese censors would read it. She knew this letter might never reach her mother's hands. But somehow, that wasn't the point. This wasn't just a letter home. It was a flare, a signal from somewhere deep inside her that the war had lost one small battle that day. When the letter passed through the intelligence offices in Japan, it would cause confusion. Some officers would suspect manipulation. Others would think it a trick. The phrase, "I was not afraid," would be underlined, translated, filed. It would sit, archived, in a folder marked with her name and a red tag labeled anomaly. They would not understand that the true anomaly wasn't her. It was the moment itself. Because inside that saloon, under dusty rafters, and between swigs of whiskey and the wheeze of a banjo, something had happened that no bullet or bomb could explain. The war had paused, not ended, not forgiven, but paused for the briefest of instants, to make space for a girl and a song. She hadn't betrayed her country. She hadn't pledged allegiance to anything. She had simply stepped out of the role they gave her and into her own skin. And that skin had laughed. It had held a harmonica. It had written a letter. And now, as the crickets hummed and the other women drifted into uneasy sleep, Aiko lay down with her arms tucked beneath her. She felt no victory, no clarity, only that same quiet truth humming through her chest. She was not afraid. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. The saloon door didn't creak when she pushed it open, it sighed, a long, slow exhale of something ancient giving way. The warm air inside, thick with the scent of pinewood, sweat, and chilly, gave one last whisper as it slipped past her shoulders and out into the cool Texas dusk. Behind her, the banjo had stopped. The voices had quieted. But they hadn't vanished. They watched her now, not with suspicion, but with something close to reverence. A cowboy near the door, the one with the bent hat and tobacco-stained fingers, tipped his head toward her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Another cowboy, younger, maybe not much older than her brother had been before the bombing, gave her a slow nod. That nod held no condescension, no command, just acknowledgement. And she did something strange. She met his eyes, held them, just long enough. She stepped out onto the wooden porch, the boards cool under the soles of her borrowed boots. The light from inside bathed her in gold for a moment before the door swung back and shut behind her with a soft clap. But the sound stayed with her, like punctuation, like a full stop at the end of a sentence she hadn't known she'd been writing. For the first time in years, Aiko did not walk with her head down. Her spine felt straighter, not from pride, but from release. Something had been shed inside that room, something heavy, inherited, and as she stepped down into the packed dirt, she didn't feel like a prisoner walking out of enemy territory. She felt like someone stepping into herself. Behind the saloon window, one of the men watched her go. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slow, like he knew he'd witnessed something. Not just the sight of a Japanese woman POW in a Texas saloon that would be strange enough, but the way she had carried herself at the end, like she wasn't afraid of them, like maybe they didn't need to be afraid of her either. What had begun as curiosity in that room, the kind you reserve for a caged animal you expect to snap, had shifted. That shift had been slow, a spoon, a laugh, a name, and then a girl, not a soldier, not a propaganda sketch. A girl, with hunger in her eyes and a harmonica in her hand. They didn't know what to make of her. Not entirely, but they respected her. And perhaps that was more dangerous to war than any weapon. Aiko made her way back toward the camp. The wind tugged at her sleeves. In the distance, the silhouettes of the barbed wire fences curled across the horizon like ribs. But they didn't feel like a cage right now. They felt like lines on a map she was beginning to redraw in her mind. And, for the first time since the transport ship, she felt like she was choosing her next step, not reacting, not surviving, but choosing. This wasn't freedom, not in the political sense, but it was something adjacent, something deeper. The right to name herself, the right to feel tall even when everything else tried to make her small. She paused once, near a patch of sagebrush. The moon was rising. She let her eyes close for just a second and breathed. That door behind her had closed, yes, but it would echo in her mind for years to come, not as an ending, but as an opening. Because she had walked in afraid, and she had walked out taller. Years would pass like wind across the plains, soft at first, then gone. The fences came down. The uniforms disappeared. Her hair, once tightly bound, now fell silver and soft down her shoulders. And the girl they had once called prisoner became something else entirely: mother, wife, and in time, grandmother. But no matter how far she traveled from that Texas camp, the saloon never left her. It lingered like the scent of chili in worn cotton, like the twang of a banjo you can't quite name. In the quiet moments when the house was still, when the tea had gone cold, she would see it again. The swinging doors, the warm wood floor, the spoon trembling slightly in her hand before it rose to her lips. That saloon had been nothing and everything, just a building, but also the place where she had first become visible, not as a soldier, not as a threat, not even as a guest, but simply as Aiko. Her granddaughter, curious and bold, once asked if she had ever seen a battle. Aiko smiled softly. "I saw something harder," she said. "I saw a man offer me music instead of suspicion." The child didn't understand. Not then. She had grown up with peace stitched into her days, unable to imagine a world where silence was survival. So, Aiko told her a different kind of war story, one that didn't smell of blood and metal, but of leather and spice. She told her about the cowboy with a crooked smile, the harmonica passed into her hands like a dare. She described the laugh that escaped her throat before she could stop it, and how, for just a moment, everyone in that room had forgotten who they were supposed to be. The girl listened, wide-eyed. "Were you still a prisoner?" she asked. Aiko shook her head. "Not for those minutes. No." She didn't speak of the barbed wire, or the way her stomach had clenched the first time she tasted American bread. She didn't explain how shame had folded itself into every act of kindness she received. Those were things too old for a child's ears. But the saloon, the warmth of it, that was something worth passing down. Because memory is strange. It keeps the softest parts, if we let it. The war had carved lines into her, yes, but it was the saloon that left the gentlest mark. Sometimes, in the final years of her life, she would hum, without realizing it, a slow, tuneless melody, almost like a banjo strummed in the distance. When her hands trembled, it was not from age, but from remembering. Not fear, but reverence. That place, those men, they had offered her nothing more than a chair, a song, and a spoon. And somehow, that had been enough. Aiko never went back to Texas. But in her mind, that door still swung open. The light still spilled across her boots. The laughter still curled around her like steam from a bowl. That single night, in all its quiet absurdity, had undone something heavy inside her. And in doing so, it had built something new, a saloon, in memory, not made of wood, but of warmth. Not filled with whiskey, but with wonder. Not a place of shame, but a place of becoming. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.